So, the inner child breaks out. It's kind of a talk about the inner child, but really it's a talk about imagination. And about what imagination is, and how to be imaginative, and how to bring imagination more fully into our lives. So there'll be quite a few ideas and reflections and even tips on what imagination is and how to be imaginative. But it wouldn't be much of a talk on imagination if I didn't give you some images and some metaphors and some stories. So I'm going to sort of interweave some of the content with some stories and metaphors. And hopefully this story won't be boring, and it will be useful. It will shed light on some of the ideas, and the ideas might shed some light on the story. As I talk, I would encourage you to maybe listen to the images that get triggered in your mind, the memories that might come to you as you listen, and indeed the questions that might come up for later in the Q&A. So firstly, let me start with the memory. When I started my training as a psychotherapist, we were invited by the trainer. The class was given the instruction: close your eyes, go inside, and find yourself in a meadow. Close your eyes, go inside, and find yourself in a meadow. And this was the start of a guided imagery session. So it's a form of a kind of like a waking dream where you use the spontaneous image making of the psyche to learn about yourself. So already on the first day we were about to be initiated into imagination, and I was quite excited because I'd been quietly mourning the loss of imagination in my life, an imagination that I remembered most clearly from childhood. And as I'd grown older, life had somehow taken on a duller, flatter texture. But I'd not given up on recapturing that more playful, story-charged, imaginative way of being in the world. And I'd been searching for it. And enrolling to train as a psychotherapist was just kind of an excuse to weave my way back to something of that way of being in the world. So here I was on the first day, on the threshold of rediscovering my lost childhood imagination. Two things went very badly wrong on that first day. My first difficulty, the lesser difficulty, was my preoccupation with the question, what exactly is an effing meadow? Because I'd only recently moved down to London. This is in 2001, and I moved to London in 1998. And I'm from Scotland, and nobody talks about meadows in Scotland. We have kind of like muddy fields with thistles and kind of sheep-wrecked uplands. But I'd never really heard somebody say in Scotland, isn't this such a great meadow? So I had an inkling that it was about long grass and wild flowers like poppies, but I couldn't quite see it. I saw beds of nettles, smatterings of dandelions. No, I didn't think that was the right thing. Ironically, the trainer was Scots with a thick Glaswegian accent, and I was thinking, she probably doesn't know what an effing meadow is either. And I think one of the reasons that I struggled with that was that I was coming at the guided imagery exercise primarily through thinking, through an emphasis on what I thought about it. All my education, all my reading, and all my time sitting at a desk at school, at university, reading books, had resulted in the loss of my childhood living in my body. I no longer inhabited the kind of sense experience that I once had on an everyday level as a child. And compared to my childhood immersion, which was the feel of a new blanket, or the smell of a new eraser, or the touch of a stick that I picked up, my adult self was missing out on that kind of texture of experience. I wasn't really in the world in the way that I'd once been. I was in my head, thinking about the world. I was reading about the world. I was watching videos about the world. I was observing experiences rather than having experiences. And so I carried over this thinking emphasis from my adult everyday life into the guided imagery. And so rather than finding myself immersed in some kind of wonderful imaginative landscape with sunlight on my face, encountering these significant figures of imagination, what was I doing instead? I was doing what I knew best. I was caught up in the idea of a meadow. Was my rather bleak Scottish idea of a meadow a good thing or a bad thing? And how would I know if it was the right kind of meadow? And anyway, why a meadow? What was so special about a meadow? What did a meadow symbolise? What did a meadow mean? And why was all this so hard? Was everyone else struggling? Probably not. Oh well, this won't last long, and I can go to that new place, and maybe I need a coffee. I'll have a coffee. So in retrospect, it was a bit of a big ask. It's kind of like inviting me to do guided imagery that first day on my training was a bit like dropping a long-term city dweller down into the middle of like a vast wilderness in British Columbia and just leaving them there without any training on how to light a fire or build a shelter or find food. The wilderness of imagination had for me become an unfamiliar place, and what I needed to do was relearn how to be in the wilderness of imagination. And as with learning to be an actual wilderness guide, you can't learn how to navigate through a forest or make a fire without matches just staying at home and reading about it. You have to spend time in the wilderness. You need to get off the sofa and get out there, and so too with imagination. I needed to get out of my head and into imagination. But what is imagination, and where does one find it? These were my questions. The second thing that went badly wrong that day, and this was the bigger thing, as well as thinking about a meadow, I was also caught up in the question, how can imagination be inside me? How can imagination be inside me? Because that was the assumption that the trainer offered. The assumption was that when I closed my eyes, I would go inside and find myself in a meadow. Fair enough. I knew it was a metaphor. It's just a metaphor. It's not like I didn't literally think the imagination was inside me. It's just a way of talking. But metaphors reveal and conceal. And I just thought the metaphor of an inner imagination concealed a bit too much. I felt like it was an unnecessary limitation, because for me, the imagination that I was looking for was so much bigger than any kind of idea of go inside. Yes, imagination was inside me, but it did not entirely live there. It did not end there. It turns out that spending time in the wilderness is perhaps more than an analogy for imagination or being imaginative. At least if you can count for wilderness a stretch of agricultural land in the central belt of Scotland just outside Edinburgh, which is where I grew up. Because a lot of my memories of this bigger imagination from childhood happened outdoors. As a child, I spent a lot of time outdoors. As much as I could, really. We built tree houses, we built dens, we dammed small streams, we played football. This was in the 1970s, when children were still allowed to roam free. I think that's because being outside tends to awaken our senses. And certainly as a small child, my sensual aliveness to the world was still more or less intact. And I think this sensual immersion goes hand in hand with the kind of imagination that I'm looking for and that I'm trying to articulate to you tonight. This bigger imagination. A sense of living not with images inside us, but living in the midst of images. So let me just share a few quick memories that allude to the kind of bigger imagination I was remembering. Wanting to throw a stone over a river so that it could join its friends. Feeling sorry for a cloud because it looks cold and lonely. Peering into a small pond and watching a tadpole swimming around through weeds, such that I kind of wondered myself into the life of this small fish and felt myself thinking and feeling as it felt and thought. Or while out walking the dog, when in the distance I would see an object, maybe across a stubble field or along the disused railway line, and I wouldn't know what that object was. It was some weird shape. It was something that wasn't normally there. It had caught my eye. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't understand it. And I would stop and stare. And I would slowly walk towards this mystery thing, looking really hard. And I would just enjoy my mind somersaulting through the possibilities. Is this a monster? Is this an alien spaceship? Is this a dragon? A giant snail? It never was any of these things. It was usually just a sack blown in the wind or something. And then an indoors example, because it's indoors too. When I was a kid, I spent hundreds of hours watching the test picture. Because in the 70s, there wasn't like TV all the time, and it was only like scheduled for certain hours, particularly on BBC Two. And the one on BBC Two, when there wasn't programmes, there was a test picture with some kind of music in the background. And I'd sit there waiting for my children's TV programmes to come on, which were the first programmes in the day. That's why we had the test picture. And there was this kind of creepy girl with a headband on and long straight hair and a blackboard with noughts and crosses that she was playing with this kind of creepy doll with a really gruesome face. Some kind of voodoo doll. And I gazed into this picture, and I had stories about this girl and what she got up to and what her life was like and how she got on with her doll. So as a child, there was a natural daydreamy perception that could not help but take in the world and turn it into stories. As if there was a life inside everything, not just inside books. And I wanted this bigger imagination back again. Not as a pejoratively romantic or as a kind of regressive return to the past, but rather as a recollection into adult life of what felt like something fundamental, something that I needed to reconnect to again to live a more fulfilling life. However, on the therapy training course, the trainers continue to talk about imagination as an inner imagination. And all the books that I was reading, nearly all the books, I found some that didn't, but most of the theory books also spoke about this imagination as inside. It was all about a journey inside and exploring our inner worlds, where we would meet our inner characters or sub-personalities and speak with them through inner dialogue. Which just left me with my question, how can imagination be inside me? Luckily, I found some comrades in this quest. Mary Watkins, the Jungian therapist Mary Watkins, she writes, "It is ironic that those psychologies which seem to give the greatest respect to the imaginal have not inquired into the subject of what they have imagined of imagining." What do we imagine the imagination is? In a similar vein, Watkins' teacher James Hillman writes, "Our approach to the imaging is predetermined by our idea of it." So if we go back to that meadow exercise, I was told to imagine that there's a bus in the meadow, and the bus pulls up at a bus stop, and off the bus come these people, and these people, I'm told, are your sub-personalities. Of course, I was completely out of it by this time, preoccupied by what is a meadow and how can imagination be inside me, and I didn't really see a bus. But let's just imagine that a small child, a boy of around 4 or 5 years old, had got off the bus. And the assumption of an inner imagination is that this small boy who gets off the bus is somehow a part of me. He inhabits my inner world. He lives inside me. He's a kind of symbol. He's a representation of a piece of my personal self, my psychology, sometimes called the inner child. And if you get to the inner child, it's not far for you to go to make the connection to the historical child, because what's been internalized is the child that you were in your history, in the events of your history. The inner child is an imprint of what happened to me as an actual child. But notice what's happened there. I've already gone quite far down the road of interpreting the imagery. I've got a small boy character who got off a bus. Complete mystery. He's now my inner child. I've taken a leap from the mysterious figure of imagination, something unknown, to something that's known, which is to say it's been related to my historical childhood. The problem with that is that it pulls me away from simply being with the imagery. By simply naming the character a sub-personality or an inner child, I've subtly turned the image of the small boy into an idea about me and an idea about my history. And I've moved away from imagining towards thinking, which creates a distancing effect. You can see this happening every day in art galleries across the land. You go to an art gallery, just watch the people, it's kind of interesting. I've done this myself, so I confess. You watch them, they go up to the painting and they spend some time looking at the painting. Not very long. And then they look at the blurb and they read the blurb. Sometimes they spend longer reading the blurb. The blurb tells them what the painting means and why there's a painting of this thing. But it doesn't quite satisfy them. They've not really been moved by the blurb and they don't understand the painting. So they go to another painting. Same thing happens. And another painting. The same thing happens. More time is spent reading text than looking at the paintings. And they keep looking for the meaning in the blurb, not the painting. Tired and perhaps a little bored, they leave with a quiet sense that an opportunity has been missed. The images have failed to touch them. And that's precisely how I felt in the guided imagery exercise with the meadow. I was quite badly disappointed because I was so excited to start with. An opportunity had missed. Something had gone wrong. But at least in the art gallery, you know that the blurb beside the painting is not the painting. That's pretty clear, right? The blurb tells us about the painting and is not the painting itself. However, and this is the thing, when you go unconscious to your assumptions about the imagination and the language that we use to describe it, you can end up forgetting the difference between our ideas about imagination, i.e. the blurb, and the actual experience of imagination itself, i.e. the painting. And concepts like the inner child, the child subpersonality, even the child archetype, these are like gallery painting blurb. These are analytical ideas. These are like a framework that help us think about the imagery. Like a map might help us think about a territory, or a guidebook might help us navigate or look at birds. The notion of an inner child is an abstraction based on an experience, not to be confused with an actual encounter with a child in imagination, whether in a dream or in a memory or even in an actual physical child in everyday life. Now, interpretation has its place, and I'm not saying never do that. But if there's one takeaway from tonight, I'd like it to be this. There's thinking and there's imagining, and it's quite good to realise that they're different things. And if you want to have a more imaginative life, try and leave your thinking for afterwards. Otherwise they get in the way of each other. And because in our highly rational culture, reason is what's emphasised, and that's why I was caught up in all this, because I'd been pushed into school and taught to think about things, explain things, come up with facts, try to understand things. Thinking is very strong and tends to eclipse our imagining. So the language that we use and the assumptions that we have and important analytical ideas can distance us from simply being with this mysterious and unknown imagery. Another distancing effect of the inner imagination assumption is that it directs us towards our inner experience and away from the activity of imagination in our everyday lives. Because if imagination is somehow inside us, not out there in the world, this makes it very difficult to look at the activity of images in our everyday lives. Because the very language that we use and the assumptions that we have aren't helping us to think of that as a possibility. We've kind of edited it out. The danger is you go to therapy and you get very well versed in guided imagery exercises or whatever, and exploring underground seas or climbing mountains, dialoguing with your inner child who sits there on a chair. But you miss out on seeing these images in your everyday life. Which is to say that your imaginative journey is going to make less impact or no impact on your actual relationships and the actual drama and the actual story that is your everyday life. So the question is, for this evening, how did I go about returning imagination to my everyday life? How did I reconnect to the bigger imagination from my childhood? Carl Jung is not often noted as the progenitor of the inner child industry. He was one of the first to pioneer the healing effects of childhood memory, and he discovered that through self-experimentation. He was a psychological pioneer. So in the early 20th century, he had a midlife crisis, he had a breakdown, and he tried to analyse it, tried to understand what was going on and how he could sort himself out, but he realised he didn't have a clue what was going on, and so he just gave himself up to the imagery that was arising in his psyche. And what kept coming to him was a memory of his childhood obsession of building miniature houses and castles with bricks. It just kept coming to him. But he was a serious-minded doctor, he's published, and he thought, I can't do that. That's silly. I'm a proper person, me. I've got a desk and people that come to me. So he resisted that for quite some time. But in the end, it kept coming, so he gave up and he returned to playing what he called his childish games. So in the mornings, before his clients came in the afternoon, weather permitting, he constructed buildings from stones that he gathered along the lake shore, playing it until his patients arrived, and then sometimes he would go back in the evening. He says, in the course of this activity my thoughts clarified and I was able to grasp the fantasies whose presence in myself I dimly felt. So that's my inspiration for one of my favourite questions as a therapist. So this is a key question I ask all clients at some stage. When you were a child and things got difficult, what did you do? Where did you go? What resources or activities or places did you draw upon to get through? Did you hide in a treehouse? Did you read lots of Enid Blyton? or did you hang out with a special friend? Because I've found that, like Jung did, that what helped us in childhood, if we can return to it, very often can still be the creative way through whatever we're dealing with now in adulthood. So to answer my own question, from the age of 8, every day started in the same way. I was always the first to wake up, and I would pull on some clothes and I'd pad downstairs so as to not wake up my parents and my 2 little brothers. And at the end of the hallway there would be these scuffling sounds from behind the door. My dog Jet, a black Labrador, had spent the night sleeping in the kitchen on the thinnest of travel rugs by the back door. And as I opened the door, he would, like, his nose would be pushing the door open further, and his tail would be like going, and his hips would be going, and his back would be arching and curving, and his paws would jump up on me. And I would get down on my knees and greet the day with greeting the dog. And he saw me through. It's emotional. Now, that stamped itself on me. I spent 10 years walking this dog. I was out in all weathers with this dog. When things were hard, I spoke to the dog. He sat with me. It was a big thing. And I was outdoors all the time with the dog. He took me outside. So it was perhaps inevitable that one day I would get a dog again. So I got past all the doubts, because rationally speaking it is a bad idea to get a puppy. Rationally speaking. Imaginatively speaking, good idea. So I got a puppy. So now what I do, once again I'm the first to wake up, and I creep out of bed, this time so as not to disturb my wife. There's no stairs, but I still pad along the hallway, not into the kitchen, but into the therapy consulting room. Where my dog Millie, now she's a duck taller, not many people know what that looks like. She's like a medium-sized, foxy red, kind of golden retriever type dog. She's very cute. And she spends the night sleeping curled up on my leather therapist's chair that I sit in when I talk to clients. So from the open doorway I say the magic words, "Okay, let's go!" And she leaps up, and she's all like tail a wag, hips a wag, and I greet my day by greeting the dog. So as I once did as a child with Jet, again I am taken outside with the dog. We go out and we walk through summer sunshine, through winter darkness. Every day starts with walking the dog. The dog leash in my hand was a bone-deep memory risen to flesh again, familiar gestures and movements transplanted to a new place and time. And as Millie, my puppy, entered the world of headlamp dazzle and fireworks, she took me with her. And what I found was that I was reconnecting to that early imaginative aliveness that I once had when I was a boy who spent a lot of time outside walking the dog. And the story I'm going to share is how walking Millie took me out of my head, away from merely observing and thinking about life, into a fuller sensory experience of my surroundings, and how this sensual experience is what took me back to that earlier, more imaginative life that I remembered from childhood and thought I had lost. Millie was a winter puppy, so a lot of our early walks took place in the dark in Finsbury Park. So we would get off the bus and walk back along Seven Sisters Road, which in the morning and nighttime rush hour was just like a line of idling traffic, and it's kind of like a tunnel of headlamps. And we'd get to the fence and we'd turn into the park, and the amazing, beautiful thing is that when you walk away from the street and the lamplight and the cars, you realise that it's not properly dark, and the lights from the road had cast only an illusion of darkness beyond their edge. In the park, naked tree silhouettes appear against a sparse cloud cover, grey-brown, tinged with orange. Faint stars and pink flash of aircraft lights, damp cold against my cheeks and hand. A metallic squeal from the far side of the park, a train slowing on its approach to the overground station. And being outside, walking the dog under shifting skies, throwing tennis balls, stepping on twigs, and sheltering behind trees from the wind and the rain. It was as if the park itself was drawing my awareness out of my head and back into the world. I was returning to living in my body and also living in my heart, not just in my head. I was returning to that much less cerebral and rational way of being that I recalled from childhood. That much bigger sense of a surrounding and immersive imagination. So I just want to describe 3 particular imaginative encounters that I had in the park to give you more of a flavour of what I'm talking about. So the first time that I really noticed that shit's happening here, something's going on, this walking the dog is strong medicine. I was standing in the park as I described, and over the tops of the trees came a sudden flight of gulls. Tens, it was over 100 gulls. Ragged black shapes against smudges of darkening blue, all bunched together, a twisting sort of 3-dimensional stream. Swips and glides, drifting, rising up over the trees and expanding overhead, and then they go past me towards the train station. And I just stood there in awe, rooted and just really intensely happy and appreciative. Another example from around the same time, we were walking along the Lee River, which is not far from Finsbury Park. And Millie's roaming ahead along the path. And the River Lee is the colour of old copper coins. And I wasn't really paying attention. I was a bit in my head. And then something, out of the corner of my eye, something broke the surface of the river with force. And I looked down. A bird, a soot black bird, oily, leathery looking bird, with a long, sinuous neck and a narrow head and a yellow eye, like some kind of water snake. And clamped in its bill was a fat fish, silvery fat fish, gleaming and glistening and very much alive in the jaws, as it were, of this fish, trying to escape, its mouth opening and closing, opening and closing. 1 minute it had been swimming around, and now this. What sense did it make of our air? How did it feel? Surely it was too big for this bird. Surely it would wriggle free and escape. And then the bird stretched up its head, stretched up its neck, threw its head back, and gulped the fish down in one. And then it just went back to being really zen and composed, as if nothing had happened, and went back to fishing again. And I was left with this sensation that this terribly mundane place, there's like graffiti, there's takeaway boxes, there's floating beer cans, there's shipwrecked shopping trolleys. This terribly mundane place had been kind of transformed into a sacred place. It had been anointed by this eruption from the depths. And it was like I'd sort of stepped out of a busy street across the threshold of a church. Third story, this is further away. We went on holiday, the dog. Me and the dog go on holiday once a year, just me and the dog. We're quite tight. We leave the wife behind. So we're walking along this beach in Machrihanish, which is in the Mull of Kintyre, on the west coast of Scotland, and it's a big beach, 2 hours long walk, and all you've got coming in is the Atlantic, and then it's America. I'm looking out for dolphins. I know that dolphins live here, and sometimes you can see them jumping. And then again, out of the corner of my eye, I come across these 2 boulders. Now, the beach in places is sandy, but also it has pebbled areas, and the pebbles are pebble coloured. They're like green and brown and grey. But these 2 boulders were large and white, like nothing else on the beach. And one of them was slightly large. One was about football size, and the other one was slightly smaller. And they were sitting there at the edge of the water, about an inch apart. And I was just incredibly struck by their presence and moved. And very quickly a story appeared in my mind, and I thought, oh my God, they've travelled for like centuries. They've come from a place where there's lots of these boulders, and they've lost all their friends and travelled, and they've stuck together all this time through storms and high seas and tides, and they've washed up here on the beach, and they're still an inch apart. And I just felt wrong, and I knelt down and I lifted up the smaller one, and I touched its cheek against the cheek of the bigger one, which felt incredibly moving. And then I gave it a little bow and moved on. So let's have some thought on this. Let's slow down and reflect on these three stories that were reminding me of this bigger imagination. Because I think moments like this happen all the time. I don't think they're that uncommon, but I think they're quite slippery, and they can be easily overlooked, glanced past. And I think partly that's because as a culture we don't really have a language for them, and particularly the inner imagination assumptions might take us away from attending to these images. So let's take a look at what's going on, try to create a new language that might help us give attention to this kind of imagination and welcome it into our lives. So I've got 4 of them. The first 3 are taken from psychotherapist Daniel Stern, and something that he calls lived story. And the 4th one is taken from Jungian therapy. So the first characteristic, imagination is brought into being or triggered by some kind of novelty. So gulls had presumably flown overhead before without me taking much notice. Perhaps I'd walked past a cormorant and eaten a fish before, but I hadn't noticed. But for some reason they became figural or novel. Having a puppy had taken me back into being in the world. You can't have a puppy and not be in the world, whether you want to be or not. To the extent you don't want to be in the world, it's painful having a puppy, so don't do it. She'd heightened my sensuous awareness in the way that, like when I was a child, maybe I'd notice the shape of a cloud and imagine it as a character. So if we attend to the ordinariness of life, eventually some floating bit of plastic or a tree's knotted bark will capture our attention and take us into imagination. Second characteristic, imagination is primarily non-verbal and lived live. So I'm recounting the story to you, I'm telling you what happened, but when it happens, you're not really thinking about it. You're not thinking, oh, this is interesting, I'll tell somebody about this one day. You're in the story. There might be some thought, but it's from within the experience. You're thinking about the stone. You're not thinking about what the imagery meant. So you might think, oh my goodness, how strange. Oh my God, how wonderful. You might have thoughts like that. But you won't be thinking, what does this mean for me? And what do these stones represent in my inner life? You're within the story. Third thing, the imaginative event has a meaningfulness that is implicit rather than explicit. There's 2 stones, for example, they captured my attention and they felt really important and it was really meaningful, and it still is, but I don't know why. So it's implicitly meaningful, but I couldn't explain to you why. In the same way that when you go to the cinema and if you've seen a really good movie and you go back out into the street and you feel good, you're not the person you were when you arrived, you've had a meaningful experience. But if somebody asked you why, you might not be able to tell them. In fact, if you started to think about it, that might ruin you feeling good about it. You've been moved by not by the language of ideas, but by the language of images. 4th point, imagination is a waking dream. I thought it'd be nice to have a name for this. There's lots of names. I'm calling it a bigger imagination. I also call it a wild imagination. In the literature, it's called a hypnagogic state, also liminal consciousness, perhaps best known as active imagination. We're active in the sense that we're immersed within it, inhabiting it live. But the best name is a waking dream, because that gets closest to what it is in a non-jargon way. And it happens to you every day. So at night time, just before you fall completely asleep, if you attend to the process of falling asleep, you have this kind of oozy in-between state where you kind of know you're in your bed, but you've kind of started to dream, but you know you're in your bed. And then in the morning as well, if you've not had an alarm wake you up, you might be in your bed, but you're aware you're in a dream as well, and you're kind of half and half. So it's a hovering on the edge of consciousness and unconsciousness, midway between waking and dreaming. And with practice, you can stretch out those moments, and they can surround you for longer and longer periods. So Finsbury Park served us well. It gave us a taste of imaginative possibilities. But then winter was over, and for the third successive year, March temperatures hit a record high. And the park got busy, and a busy park is a littered park. And it became basically a smorgasbord of doggy delicacies. And it just wasn't fun running around after the dog trying to get her to not eat things that she shouldn't eat. So it was time to move on. So in the summer, we move on. And we needed more space anyway. We needed more green space. We needed more space to explore imagination. What we wanted, what we needed, was the forest. And if you're living in North London, that means Epping Forest. One of the largest of the ancient forests we have left in the UK. The edge of the forest feels like the limit of the civilized world. And stepping into the forest, becoming surrounded by the atmosphere of the trees, it feels archetypal. It feels like a fairy tale. It feels like that once upon a time feeling that is perhaps imprinted into our bones from childhood, and perhaps from further back, from our collective memory of when the whole kingdom was covered in trees, and to travel anywhere required a journey into and through the wild unpredictability of the forest. Millie skips away ahead of me, ears pricked up, tail up, nostrils working overtime, taking in the forest aromatics. And she races off down these little trails, and she disappears into the forest. And I follow her in, which is to slow down, because these little trails through the forest, they're not in any rush to get anywhere. They take their time and they wander around obstacles, around the trees, around the boulders. They follow the natural contours of the land. And they squeeze through the undergrowth. And sometimes they open up into the brightness of wide glades and clearings. And you never know what you're going to find, or who you're going to find. And one of the best things that we've found in Epping Forest is this kind of like deluxe lean-to den thing. There's lots of dens in the forest that people make out of like there's a tree that's fallen down and they put branches up against it and they create this kind of tent-shaped shelter. But this one was like a really well-engineered one, and it wasn't just it turned a corner, so it had the edges. And we went inside, and there was a bed made out of branches, and a little seat made out of branches, and a little table. And we sat down in this little lean-to den. And on the floor, underneath the stone, there was a little message written down that had been folded up. So I picked up this, and I read it out, and it said, "Thank you, whoever you are, for building this beautiful shelter. Love, the tree fairies." And it was a bit like that. It was quite enchanted, and I felt really calm inside this den. And it was so good that Millie even calmed down too, until this amazing fox. It's like the healthiest fox you've ever seen. It was really like bright orange and glowing with health. not a city fox, just wandered out of the ferns. Didn't know we were there until Millie picked up its scent, and then she chased it away. So one of the games that we play when we go to Epping Forest is the Find That Den game, because we've never found it again. I've spent, tens of hours looking for this den, crisscrossing this section where I think it's going to be, and I've got into thinking that it never really existed in the first place. And the deep relaxation and stillness I felt was some kind of fairy enchantment, which you can kind of get into thinking like that when you're in the forest. But every time I go to the forest and look for the den, I add to my forest story, which is to say I weave together the glades, streams, tree stumps with the events connected to them. That's the muddy water hole that Millie loves to jump in. This is the glade where sometimes that strange man can be found. This is the bank of ferns from where the fox emerged twice now. And in playing my Find the Den game, I am living in a story that is connecting me to the forest. I'm learning how to be in the forest. In the same way that once upon a time, when we lived for generations in one place, the stories and memories of and about that place were passed down to us through the generations. Stories about hunting, fishing, trapping, foraging, tree felling. Stories about sickness and healing, about animals and ancestors, about winds, thunder and rain. Such that the longer people lived in one place, and the more stories there were, and the more lessons that got passed down, the more skilled people became in living gracefully in their home place. However, in not being born in the forest or anywhere near the forest, in not having elders from previous generations to tell me about the forest, my Find the Den game was a way of cultivating my own local culture, my sense of belonging to the place where I live. And in relation to our theme, the childhood bigger imagination, I was tracing the lines back to that earlier time from childhood when I had a much more intimate connection to my home place. Because as children, before we learnt to read, before we learnt to associate stories with books, stories were the tales that we told about our surroundings, about the encounter with the friendly dog outside the corner shop, or the squeaky swing that we played on in the park, or the slippy ice path beside the fast-flowing stream. Our childhood relationship to our home place is expressed through story. Pre-literate children do not read texts. They read images. They read their surroundings. And if we were lucky enough as children, we found a safe enough place to express our innate storytelling sensibility. Which is to say, we grew up hearing stories and being told stories. And also, just as crucially, we grew up having a ready audience to listen to our stories. However, come a certain age, the rules of permission narrow, and the adult world, slowly at first, then more and more rapidly, stops indulging our stories. Until it becomes no longer cute to talk to adults about how sad we are the cloud ran away, or that the stone sank to the bottom of the pond, or the squirrel that has not come back for 3 days now. We lose our audience. And we are directed away from the voices of our animal friends and the trees and plants and stones, and instead invited to pay attention to the voices and stories that live inside books. And while we're doing that, we're spending a lot less time outside and a lot more time indoors, rammed into a desk, and these days stuck behind a screen. And in this way we lose our story connection to our surroundings, because the stories that we're reading in the books are not about the neighbour's dog or the trip to the newsagents. The stories we're reading in books are about other places, far away places. We might read about the River Thames and the City of London, but it resembles nothing that we've ever seen. Stories no longer direct us to our surroundings, and our attention is wrangled away from what we immediately imagine, such that the surface images of everyday life lose their vitality, and imagination shrinks back from the world. No longer a perceptual interaction with the trees, tadpoles and plastic bags blowing in the wind. Imagination becomes an abstract place, perhaps an inner place, separate from our surroundings. And one of the ways you can see the death of the storytelling way of being in the world is when you ask someone, how did you get on today? And you go, okay. It works really well with teenagers, particularly teenagers on smartphones. Or you say, how was it? You go, no, it was alright. And it might just be that they don't want to talk to you. Fair enough. They've got a smartphone, why do they need to talk to you? But perhaps it's because they've lost their ability to tell stories. And just saying okay is a cover for not knowing how to tell a story and for not knowing how to shape events into a narrative, which is significant. Because if you can't tell a story, that's not just about your sense of belonging and your connection to where you are in the world. That's about yourself, because to the extent that we lack a story, we also lack a sense of ourselves as a character in that story, which is to say we lack a sense of our identity, our personhood, the kind of person we are. And you come to feel adrift and ill at ease and uncertain and confused as to who and what you are. Presumably, if you'd lived in the same place your whole life, with generations that had lived in that same place their whole life and heard their stories, you would know who you are and what you are. We've lost local cultures. So the question for me is, if it's stories that tie us to place, and if it's stories that give us a sense of belonging, then how do we go about finding these stories? How do we undo the disconnect between imagination and place, between imagination and identity? One of the ways you could do that, if you've moved away from your birthplace, is to retire and go back to where you were born. Or just move back there. Don't wait till you retire. That might be too long. And a lot of people do that, or a lot of people spend their life longing to go back and live in that birthplace, because they have stories, also known as memories, about that place. And when they're in that place, it triggers not just the stories about that place, about the particular streets and houses and trees, people. Doesn't just trigger the stories, it also triggers that way of being in the world, that storied way of being in the world, and the sense of aliveness, of being embedded in a place that you belong to. However, I don't think you need to return to your birthplace to find your storied life again. You can find new stories, and that's what I was doing with Millie in the forest. You can cultivate a relationship to your home place, wherever that is, even if it's like a flower box on a windowsill, or a crappy little park with like rubbish floating around in it. Spend some time there, come into a relationship with it, listen to the stories that that place has, see what lives there, how it speaks to you. And a way of thinking about therapy, and this is a nice way that I like to think about therapy, is that we're helping people to tell their stories. The therapist gives us an audience once more to tell our story. The therapist is a willing ear that listens. And we learn once more to talk about our place, our locations, the atmosphere of that place, and the characters that we play in this story that is our lives, and also the other characters that we meet there, aka our relationships. However, relationships need not be limited to human relationships. Spending time in the forest, I was touching back on a key aspect of that bigger imagination from childhood that I alluded to earlier, which was the ability to be like drawn out of myself and into the life of the creatures and places around me. The ability to let my imagination take me into the world of a small tadpole swimming amid the weeds in a small pond, as if I was the tadpole. Because when I was younger, my sense of self had not consolidated. It wasn't firmed up, and I was able to play around with my identity in an unself-conscious way, and able to take these leaps of imagination. And I have really good memories of crawling around on the floor, saying, "I'm not Alan, I'm a lion!" And I really believed that I was a lion, and I knew that I wasn't a lion. And the fact that those two things were true at the same time didn't seem to matter. Because for a child, the literal and the metaphorical are a bit blurred. They've not separated out what's real from what's unreal and pejoratively imaginary. So spending time in the forest, it's kind of relaxing, and that allows your identity to soften. I think a relaxed self isn't just a relaxed version of your normal self. A relaxed self is a shift in perspective. And alongside my awakening sensual aliveness taking me into my environment, I was touching on this kind of shape-shifting malleability of imagination. And I noticed it first of all with trees, because on the walks you'd have to have a rest, and you'd want to think, well, where's a good tree, and where can I get out of the sun the best, or out of the rain the best? And you'd rest against a tree, you'd lean against a tree. Maybe I'd run my hands over the bark of the tree, and my senses are drawn towards the tree. I'd let my feet sink down into the leaf mould around me. And usually Millie would pick up on the vibe, and she would lie down and quieten down as well. And gradually, without noticing at first, my centre of consciousness moves from here, as it were, into the tree. I feel a sort of empathy for the tree, and an awareness that's not just on the surface of the tree, but it kind of like moves into the interiority of the tree, into what the tree must feel and think, which is to feel rooted and calm. And time is different if you're a tree. It's not in seconds and minutes. Tree time is like in seasons and years. So time kind of expands, and movements unfold like the opening of a flower bud. Everything's kind of gradual, and there's a stillness. I've shape-shifted into a perspective of a tree. Or it might happen suddenly, more quickly, when all of a sudden I shudder and I become alert. I don't know why. And I feel like I'm being watched, and I slow down, and then I stop, and then I'm just looking, and there's nothing and nothing. And then, two deer, I see them, they're watching me and I'm watching them, and nobody's moving anymore. And it's like a heightened sensitivity to what's going on. And Millie's downwind, she's not picked up on the deer yet, but they're watching her. And then, boom, they jolt into action, striding, leaping, crashing through and out of sight. And I listen to them as they pass off through the forest. And I feel my heart beating fast, my chest rising, and I'm in this heightened state, as if the deer's sensing has, for a moment, eclipsed my human sensing, and I feel more animal and less human, less domesticated, more something else, wilder, rangier. So, how do you shapeshift? Let's have some lessons. 3 lessons in how to shapeshift, if you want to do that. First thing is, as we've been talking about, you need to allow the possibility for this kind of imaginative access. And my hunch is that this happens a lot. Shapeshifting's happening all the time, in a way. But to the extent that we don't believe in it, and we think the boundaries around our sense of self are quite separate, keep us separate from the rest of the world, we don't notice the effects of shapeshifting. But perhaps when you get on the underground or the bus to go home this evening, and you choose where to sit down, you could think of that as a shapeshifting, because you've tuned into, quite unconsciously, the other people in the carriage or the bus, and you're making all these little decisions on where you want to sit, what atmosphere, and you might pick up on, oh, I'm not sure about them, I'll sit down over here. So lesson number 1, allow the possibility that how we feel, how we think, might not be our normal habitual way of thinking and feeling. We might have been infected by what we're attending to. Second thing is, you can't make shape-shifting happen. You can't control it or create it consciously. Just like you can't make yourself feel happy, you can't make yourself fall in love, you can't even make yourself fall asleep. Especially you can't even make yourself fall asleep. Feelings just come and go. Feelings are like wild animals. They're not under your control. They just kind of pass through. And just like approaching an actual wild animal, you can't come at them directly. They run away. So you've got to come at it sort of sideways. You can't force shape-shifting. If you force yourself to shape-shift into a tree, what you'll end up doing, because you're doing it consciously, you'll end up coming up with thoughts for what you think a tree thinks. And you end up coming with feelings for what you think a tree feels. But they'll just be hypotheses of your own habitual perspective. You're not really in the tree. You're not really thinking like the tree. So, you can't make it happen. You've got to come at it directly, which is the third point. And that's what we get taught when we learn to be therapists. You get taught to shapeshift. It's just that we call it empathy or counter-transference. So you sit there with someone and you listen to them and you attend to, obviously, what they say, but you attend to how they say it and how they move, and you're noticing their facial expressions and their body gestures. You're noticing the distance, whether they're looking at you or not. And slowly you come to feel infected by how they feel. You might even become infected by how they think. We call it counter-transference, which is like a technical way of saying shape-shifting. A person's kind of entered into you and you're beginning to see the world through their eyes, which is really useful, because then if you express that, that's deeply empathic for them, to know that somebody understands what it's like to be like them. Same with trees. You sit there and you attend to the tree. You touch it with your hand, you listen to the wind through the branches and the leaves. You feel your back against the trunk, and slowly you move into the tree. So, every modern child begins life not writing code in an office cubicle, but spontaneously being drawn to the outdoors, to animals and plants, and through play spontaneously shape-shifting into a lion. I'm not Alan, I'm a lion. So the question is, why does that happen? What's the point? Why do children have such fulsome imaginations? And why do they live in such a storied world if it's just going to get knocked out of them through the education process? So I'll give you an answer. This is one answer. And one answer to this question comes from anthropology and psychology, from an evolutionary view. And it goes like this. Recent cultural changes in our way of life, technology, moving to a city, being on Facebook, Twitter, these things, evolutionarily speaking, have happened in a very short space of time. The agricultural revolution began around 10,000 years ago. The industrial revolution around 300, 200 years ago. But before that, human beings had lived for hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, living almost entirely outdoors, moving around in small tribes, telling stories and living off the land. And it was against this lifestyle, this life way, that our species, Homo sapiens, evolved. Our bodily senses, our minds, our psychology, our meaning-making have been shaped by the savannah. And we're still hardwired, to use a modern metaphor, in exactly the same way as we were during the Paleolithic. Our DNA, our brains, our eyes and our ears, they're the same as they were hundreds of thousands of years ago. Evolution takes time, and on an evolutionary scale, the rise of the modern city is a highly novel environment to which we are ill-adapted as a species. We're not designed to spend so much time indoors. We're not designed to travel around at high speeds in airplanes. We're not designed to, drink out of a can. So if we count each generation as 30 years, only 7 generations have passed in the 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, and only 400 generations have passed since the beginning of agriculture, compared to 17,000 generations that have passed since the first rise of Homo sapiens as a distinct species. Cultural changes are fast, but evolution takes time, a long time. And culturally, we're living in this technical, digital world. Evolutionarily speaking, we're living in the savannah, in the Stone Age. And the extant hunter-gatherer cultures that have been studied, what does their life look like? They've got a highly developed sensitivity towards the natural world, and they imbue that natural world with a sensibility and intelligence and purpose similar to the human world. Just as a person has an interiority of feelings and thoughts, so too do each plant, animal and place have such an interiority. To a hunter-gatherer, the earth is not a thing, an object to sit on. The earth is alive and other to sit alongside, which, as we've seen, hopefully, is incredibly similar to how we see the world in childhood. The enchanted world of the childhood is, if you like, the ancestral inheritance of the psychic wholeness of how we once were in the savannah. Children recapitulate the psychological wholeness of our ancestors. Every young child simply knows deep in their bones how to extend out imaginatively across the species barrier and identify with and converse with trees, animals and plants. And through reconnecting to that bigger imagination of our childhood, we are turning the clock back to pre-modern times, back to the time when fairy tales were part of a living oral storytelling tradition, when the tales were local stories tied to the land, before the Grimm's brothers gathered them all up, edited them down, generalised them, got rid of all the telltale local details, and sort of told them in this kind of everywhere and nowhere style. Reconnecting to this bigger imagination from childhood, we're going back to the times when indigenous cultures the world over recognised the wisdom of our childhood perception, and rather than knocking it out of their children, they encouraged and developed it into a mature form in adult life, using it as a skill for healing, for navigation and for hunting. The anthropologist Hugh Brody writes, hunter-gatherer knowledge is dependent on the most intimate possible connection with the world and with the creatures that live in it. The possibility for transformation is a metaphor for complete knowledge. The hunter and his prey move so close to one another as to cross over, the one becoming the other. Here is an intimacy that secures complete understanding. Being able to move with accuracy on the ground appears to require a parallel freedom of movement in thought, an absence of constraint, a welcoming of many states of mind, from humour to trancing, a fluidity of boundaries, a porousness of divisions, can be seen as useful and normal. However, as we've seen, our modern world pushes us away from our childhood imagination it has pushed us away from our ancestral selves, to the extent that the early colonialists struggled to even relate to indigenous people as human beings. It's not just the education that has knocked the bigger imagination out of us. At every turn, modern life pushes us away from the evolutionary normal lifestyle of our species. So the question is, what's a natural environment and lifestyle for a human being? Evolutionary psychologists talk of trans-historical needs. And these are the needs that we have as an inbuilt evolutionary expectation in our DNA. This is what we need to be whole, to be happy and healthy. And these needs hold regardless of cultural changes. Regardless of the time that we're born into, we have these trans-historical needs. The need to be outside pretty much constantly from morning to night. The very air and sunlight, essential nutrients. The need to move around, to squat, reach out, crawl, walk, run, sprint, swim, and climb. The need to spend our whole lives with one small tribe, with people who know us intimately from birth to death. The need to have emotional relations with the more than human world of animals, plants, and places. Modern humans, as we know, are incredibly insulated from the sensual reality of our ancestors. I don't need to tell you this. Houses and central heating shield us from the elements. Weather reports, you don't even need to look out the window now to see what the weather is. Electric lighting, it's dark, just turn on the lights. The internet replaces physical human interaction. And even when you step outside, you step into a car, or there's buildings shielding you from the natural environment. Almost at every turn there's a distancing layer of technology, a secondary experience replacing primary sense-based knowledge of the world, pushing us into our heads, pushing us into abstractions, pushing us into fantasy. And this is one way, and I think it's a pretty convincing way, to understand the adult loss of imagination, not to mention our depression and anxiety. To the extent that we've become separated from our evolutionary trans-historical needs, we're kind of like cutting ourselves off, not just from our childhood selves, but from the psychological wholeness we once had as hunter-gatherers on the savannah. Modern life is inherently alienating, and if you don't believe me, Freud said it too, over 100 years ago. Freud claimed that as civilization advances, our natural desires are frustrated ever more by the external pressures of mechanical and technological change, and also how that becomes internalized, what he called the superego, which is what keeps down our ancestral self. The superego suppresses our ancestral self, it suppresses our childhood self. And if you like, when you start to feel a psychological distress, well, that's a good thing, because that's a revolt of your human nature. That's your ancestral self saying, these repressive social and cultural conditions are too much. I've had enough of the demands and abuses of modern life. Let's find another way. So, moving towards conclusion. So for me it was walking the dog. But it could have been any practice. You don't need a dog. Any kind of physical practice done regularly with awareness, I think would have had a similar effect. A relationship with something beyond us, out with our complete control, that requires commitment, the development of some skills, and a willingness to be bored, to loosen the ties of instant gratification. A practice that's physical, that takes me out into my senses, into the encompassing world. It might have been gardening, it might have been painting in oils, it might have been baking bread. I took up dog walking. And I think what was significant for me in that, as I mentioned, was it took me back to a practice that I remembered and had done previously as a child. The lead in my hand, tending the small dog, took me back to that earlier time and that earlier way of being. We've done Freud, let's do Einstein. Albert Einstein said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honours the servant and has forgotten the gift." My adult life had become a bit like a journey through the woods at dusk with a torch, a pocket torch of reason, and I'd forgotten how to turn it off. And it pointed things out, but it meant I didn't see what was at the edges of my vision. In a way, it was a tunnel into the darkness. I wasn't using my other senses. I was focused on the bright tunnel of reason. I lost my imagination. I couldn't see more of the woods. I couldn't see the fuller picture. And going back into Finsbury Park that first winter with Millie was literally to leave behind the bright lights of the computer screen, the home, and the bright lights of the streets. And as I walked with Millie in the dawn and dusk of the park, I let go of the bright lights of my reason, and I turned off my too bright torch, and I started to learn again how to use my other senses. I started to learn again how to see a fuller picture. Walking with Millie, I remembered the sacred gift of imagination. I learned that getting outdoors, even into a city park or a forest on the very edge of London, can soften the veil of separation between self and world. I learned that my enchanted childhood self and my psychologically whole ancestral self are very much still there, quietly waiting for opportunities beyond internet shopping and Netflix. And I learned how to free the inner child from her indoor prison. The inner child broke out, once again free to roam wild and free, to play once more in the wide world, to walk the dog and listen to the wind through the trees. Thank you.